After the disappointment of Red Bull's launch with its repainted show car, Aston Martin has given us a real cracker of a launch, with a full, real car and also a whole bunch of very detailed renders that we can use to analyze all the different aerodynamic components on the car. In this video, we're going to look at all the different aero features of interest on the car and discuss potential aero intents for these areas and what they could be doing down the car. For those of you that are new to my channel, I was an aerodynamicist for Mercedes for the 2018, 19 and 20 Formula 1 seasons, and now I work as an aerodynamic consultant designing aero kits for race cars in all different classes all around the world. Now this of course is not a race one car. We don't know what changes they're going to make coming to the first race. There's certainly a lot of really interesting details and there's a lot of stuff that I think they will carry forwards into certainly testing and most likely the early races. There's also a few things that are definitely cheeky on legality, and so we'll run a bit through those and talk about where they've really been pushing the rules to the absolute limits. Let's waste no more time and get straight into the front to back analysis of the car. Okay, to start with at the front wing, you'll note that the first element of the front wing is separated off the front and then everything else is cleanly mated into the nose. Now on face value, there's not a dissimilar setup to the Haas, but it's actually a little bit different in how the nose mates itself. If you have a look, the front leading edge of the front element comes in really on the front of the nose. It blends in almost perfectly with the front of the nose. And if you have a look at this bit here, you'll see that the trailing edge mates perfectly up to where the nose is on the underside. This will actually give it a really clean under nose profile, because what you've probably got is where the wing goes into the nose, the curvature of the nose would match almost perfectly the curvature of the underside of the wing element. So that's a really nice way of doing it, and you avoid any sort of notches like the Haas had to run, where you had the little kick-ups there and there where it had to mate to its nose. It's a pretty clean way of doing the junction and a pretty smooth way of doing it. Now one of the things you really notice with this particular front wing is how high the center is with respect to legality, particularly compared to the likes of the Haas, but it is quite a high front wing in the center. So you have a look, I've overlaid my own little drawing of a legality box here, and you can see that the wing is on legality at the leading edge on the outboard portion more or less, and then it sort of comes up in the center, and then we've got this higher center section there. Now that high, really backed off center section is going to give you really nice, clean airflow through here, which is going to come through and hit the forward floor and the T-tray or bib area that we'll talk a bit about later. Now the compromise for this is that you lose a bit of load in the center section by not cranking it as much. So you have to regain that load elsewhere. If you follow the trailing edge of the rearwardmost element along, you'll see that it matches the profile of the legality box very closely in that sort of mid to outboard portion over here. So they've obviously really had to crank the wing there. The front's almost at legality, the back's almost as high as possible. This cranking has possibly cost them in terms of cake tin management. They might have a bit less downwash onto their cake tin deflectors and things like that. It might be a bit less clean flow getting to the cake tin. Perhaps there's a bit of lower wake management that's lost as a result of that, but that may be the trade they're choosing to go for, where they can get that really nice clean flow in the center instead, where that perhaps is more profitable for them. Another real feature to note is this divot that we've got going on through here. So you can see they've come off legality here with this divot that cuts down. Now it has to guess that they're doing basically what I spoke about in the last video, which is they're going to try and shed a little bit of sheet vorticity along here, try and spool up a little bit of a vortex. And then beyond that, the inboard section has to come up so that it can mate nicely with the bodywork and the nose junction through there. So I'd say that's what they're doing there. And on the subject of that vorticity and vortex shedding along there, they've done something very cheeky with their little flap adjuster. So while Haas was doing this to a smaller extent, Aston has really taken it to the next level, where they've taken their separator where their flap pivots, and they've put this giant, relatively giant given the rules and the location, delta winglet on top of the last element of the front wing. Now this is going to shed a vortex off the back of it, which will propagate downstream. They've obviously used it for some form of flow control further downstream, use it from somewhere to cast off the vorticity in a defined location. I couldn't tell you exactly what they're using it for, but that is almost certainly going to cast a nice big vortex off it. Another thing to note with the size and positioning of the front wing is how much of the legality box it fills up. You can see in this overlay that I've done of the legality boxes that the front wing box is basically fully filled by the front wing. So they're really maximizing that legality space and trying to maximize the load generating potential of the front wing, which of course feeds back into what I was earlier saying about backing off the center so that you can get the clean flow there, because they can back that off and still have the plan form available to make that all up. On the subject of plan form, you'll note that the two forward elements are significantly larger than the two rearwards elements. Now, some of this is probably structural. The middle element is where the bulk of the structure is going to be because you're going to end up with that structure being passed into the nose cone there, whereas the thinner or shorter chord rearward elements will not carry as much structure because they'll be pivoting flaps and the like. The front element doesn't mate in to the nose itself, so it has to pass all its load out into this second element here. In addition to that, there's every chance that they may have found some form of aerodynamic cleanup by going to the two front elements being long chord and the two rear elements being short chord. That may have just been a very aerodynamically efficient way of powering up the wing. Now, I spoke a bit about the front flap pivot being a fairly cheeky interpretation of the rules, but they've actually gotten a lot cheekier on this car, and the first thing that I spotted was this particular T-tray area. Now, the cars are allowed to have a T-tray or the bib. You'll note on the Haas, it's a fairly conventional thing. The main column of the bodywork goes down into the bib, and then it fillets into the bib, all nice and conventional. But when we look really close on the Aston, what we see is there's actually two T-trays essentially stacked on top of each other. And this is, at least from my interpretation of the rules, not exactly how the FIA intended it, and let's explain why. The rules state that you define two different bodies. You define yourself a floor volume, that will look something like that back here, and then you define yourself a bib volume, which will be some sort of shape that will look something like that. Now, the requirements on these bodies are fairly well laid out. The floor is allowed a minimum radius of 25 millimeters at any point, so a pretty big radius on it. The bib is allowed a 15 millimeter radius at any point when viewed from the top. However, when you get to the edge, you can run much sharper radii just so you can get the sharp corner down and have a shedding edge on the edge of the bib. Both of these volumes must be a single volume with no aperture, and then both of them, when you look from the bottom and the top, you must be able to see the whole volume. So this means that basically, for example, with the bib, you couldn't go for something like this because from the top or the bottom, you wouldn't be able to see this bit in here. Now, once you've defined these two particular olumes, you're allowed to join them with a fillet of up to 50 millimeters. And I think that what the FIA was thinking with that was that you'd have your bib, you'd have your body, and then you'd put some sort of fillet like that in. Now, the thing with the FIA regs is that they say that a fillet radius no greater than 50 millimeters may be applied along the periphery of where these volumes intersect. They don't actually specify how small it can be, nor do they specify its convexity or its concavity. And I wonder if what the Aston guys are interpreting it as is that they can apply any fillet radius along there. So they've built essentially 50 mil, say, fillet out, and they've got a sharp fillet around and then another fillet back. And that's how they're getting their basically second T-tray in there. I had a quick play in CAD and I couldn't get a geometry that would be perfectly legal, but they have a lot more resource on this than me just having a very quick stab at it, and so they probably have been able to get up a solution that they could at the very least argue to the FIA is legal. But it's certainly a very interesting and very cheeky interpretation of the rules if it is in fact valid. Now, in terms of what the aerodynamic intent of this secondary T-tray could be, well, there's two vortices that are going to spool off the sides of the bib normally, and depending on whether this is an upwashing or downwashing T-tray and extension here, I can't tell because I don't have the local flow direction, but if it was an upwashing winglet, so the flow was, say, coming down and the winglet is trying to push it up, it could weaken the shedding strength of the vortices at the bottom and shed a new set of vortices up high. Splitting these vortex strengths can help clean the whole system up while still maintaining decent power. It's particularly good if you're really desperately trying to clean an overpowered floor vortex system there. Or alternatively, if it was downwashing, what it could do is that if the air was, say, coming straight and the T-tray was angled down, it would produce extra pressure at the front here, and that would force the vortices off the bib to be generated stronger and harder. So that would be a good solution if they were underpowered and you saw more performance getting more power. And you might be able to get a counter-rotating vortex structure, so a vortex shedding the opposite way off the top. Either way, they must have found performance in it, because otherwise there's no way that they would be running a device that would be potentially contentious. Now moving back, let's talk a little bit about the strakes. Now these pictures are a little bit blurry and I apologize for that, but you've got to work with what you've got. But basically, as far as I can tell, there are 4 strakes. There's the outboard fence, and then you've got 1, 2, 3 there. So 4 strakes all up, arranged in a side-by-side format going on there. I'm not going to speculate too much on how that 4-strake layout is playing out, but I assume that it works for them. But I think what's more interesting to talk about is their outer strake, which is kind of a bit like a barge board. It goes pretty much the whole way forwards to legality, and it's got quite a substantial cant on it when you look at that angle there. It's really lent out at the top and pulled in at the bottom. But I imagine that there's things that this strake is potentially telling us. One is it could be related to the wake shape on the car. If they don't perhaps have a huge amount of lower wake control, I know there's the FIA deflector there, but maybe it's somewhat compromised with that outboard cranked front wing. The wake could be finding its way a bit inboard, and they could be prioritizing trying to drive it back outboard. So cutting that in there will give a little bit of extra clearance to help kick the wake further upwards, rather than if you ran it straight up and down like that. And then what could happen is that you could ingest a bit of wake on the inboard side, which you don't really want. You'd rather keep it all outboard. Another thing to note on the strakes in the top view is that they are not actually present ahead of the leading edge of the floor. Now, at first I thought they might be removed from the render, but if you have a look at some of the other render shots, they are definitely in there. And when you have a look at where they're positioned on the full-size real-life shots, they might not be there on that either. So I'm thinking they actually start back here somewhere. And maybe that's why they've gone with the 4-strake setup, because it's 4 shorter strakes. And maybe they need to run the 3 full-length strakes in terms of full length to the back of the box here in order to power up the vortices they need. Now let's talk a bit about that sidepod, which is one of the more interesting design features on the car. At the front, they've rammed it right up to the legality box. And I'll show you what this looks like on a top view. This is a comparison to the Haas here, and you can see that the Haas has their inlets about here. It's fairly tight on their mirror there. The Aston is much further forwards to there, and you can see the outboard portion of their side pod is really rammed up there. Basically, the legality box goes flat here and then angles back there, and they've really pushed it right up as hard as they can get it there. That's resulted in the flat face squished bit here. Now it's worth noting that the side pod doesn't go outboards all the way to legality. They've kept it in a bit, so perhaps they're worried about that mid-wake latching onto the bodywork, and so they've just pulled in a little bit to make sure that it's clear of the tyre wake and the tyre wake can sail down the side of the car without touching the bodywork. The other thing this has allowed them to do is put an absolutely monstrous undercut under here. If you follow along this bright green line with your eye, what you can see is that this side pod basically gets cut fully underneath there, and then it purely down washes on its own. There's actually a complete air gap underneath there all the way back to pretty much the tub, it looks like. Now there's 2 reasons I can think of why you'd want to do this. One is that the floor leading edge is downwashing quite aggressively on the top surface, so you could end up with some losses and separations on the top surface that could go downstream, and you don't really want that. By having this acting as basically a downwashing wing over the top of it, we can end up with some overall downwash, and we can end up with some support of this area so that the losses don't expand and become too big, keeps it from separating, and therefore we can get nice clean flow downstream. The other thing it can do is that any clean flow that we have from upstream in the center of the wing, because we talked a lot about how the center of the wing is probably feeding very nice clean flow along the center line, any flow there, we can really capitalize on the fact that we've got nice high energy flow, and we can keep that attached to our coke line and keep all our cooling stuff above there. And this means that we can get that high energy air down and into the rear cake tin and the top of the rear diffuser and the side of the rear diffuser, maybe even a little bit to the beam wing, and that can power up a lot of the critical devices at the rear end. I personally think that's a really innovative solution, and I'm excited to see how it performs. It also looks like it biases a little bit of the outwash of the undercut back to this region here, where maybe they can drive a little bit more outwash into this region of the floor where they've got this flap that's a little bit longer than the Haas one, and they've got the rearward section of the flap is quite loaded with a little gurney flap. So maybe they're using that to drive a little bit more outwash there, get a little bit more upwash off the flap, and therefore get a little bit more suction and extraction from the forward floor. It's also worth noting that the front flap, or the wing flap that they're allowed on the edge of the floor, is missing from this car. Now, whether or not they've elected to not use it, I find that unlikely, or more likely is that they have an innovative way of using it and don't want to show it off yet. So I think that will be a very interesting thing to watch for testing in race 1. So how have they achieved this overall effect? Well, I mean, obviously they've got their inlet high and inboard and their massive width side pod at the front, right at the front of legality, obviously not full legality. And then what they're doing is that they probably have some variant of more or less a horizontal or similar radiator, and then they have all their venting in this brand new legality box up here that I talked about in the last video, where they're allowed to have these gills and vent out over the top. Now, this venting could do two things. One is that it will increase the losses up high, so your rear wing might get hurt a bit, although maybe the rear wing box is big enough that it's okay. The other thing it could do is that it could help detach any latched wake. If we had any wake come onto the bodywork and latch on, this vent could help detach it. Maybe it would kick it up and outboard away from the rear wing. Very hard to know for sure. But what I'd say is, in general, this is probably a compromise of hurting the performance of the rear wing slightly in exchange for a fairly sizable performance gain down at the bottom of the diffuser, beam wing, and cake tin. And all this means that we get this really tiny central airflow exit in the center there, much smaller than we've seen in previous years. And that would just be to get a little bit of cooling air past the exhaust, the headers, the engine, stuff like that. So really looking at maximizing performance of the lower car systems there. It is worth noting though that venting losses upstream does have problems. With respect to loss up there can be a little bit less controlled because it's got a longer distance to move downstream, so there's more chance that it could drift around, particularly in any sort of cornering or yaw or crosswind condition where the losses could move a little bit more than if you vent them at the rear, which is obviously a bit more controlled. Now, before we get too far rearwards, let's talk a little bit about the kick lines and the diffuser. So what we've got here is it looks like quite a prominent secondary kick along there. So it looks like they're down probably on the bottom limit of legality along here, going along a fairly sharp kick there. So we have a kick along there, a flatten, which I imagine is going to be at the top of legality, and then a kick running along what is presumably the top of legality as well. And what this sort of geometry will do is it will improve your suction here because you've got a kick line here, so you'll get a bit of extraction through here, a bit of suction here that will propagate forwards, and then you'll get more kick and suction along here. By keeping this section low, they can maximize the effect of the ground proximity through that portion of the tunnel. You don't necessarily want that bit to be as high as it is, so that solution makes quite a bit of sense to me. Now, there was one solution that I spotted that at first I wasn't sure if I was actually seeing it, but it looks like it's actually quite an interesting solution. So out at the end, we've got this tiny little curl up. That's all well and good. I expect a few teams to be running a detail similar to that to be getting a little bit of load and a little bit of loss into the contact patch of the rear tire. But then as you go a little bit further inboard, it looks like we actually have a cut up in the sidewall, and then it goes down into a notch more or less like that on the diffuser sidewall. And at first I saw it on these shots and I wasn't sure if it was just an artifact of enhancing the image, but I had a look at some other renders and it's very much real. If you look at this, you can see the exact geometry I described. A flat section here, going up, and then coming down like that along the sidewall. So what they're doing here, most likely, is that they're going to induce some nice clean mass flow from there into the diffuser and really help spool up a clean vortex along the edge of the sidewall. So instead of getting a messy junction going on in this particular corner with a sharp corner and a whole bunch of losses, they've just cast any vortices from the tunnel off into the diffuser, and they've gone and started a brand new sidewall strake, if you will. That is, I think, quite a very clean and nice way of doing it, and I wouldn't be surprised to see a few different teams running that solution. While we're at the back here, you can also see they're running that same sort of trumpet to exit style diffuser, so with the sharp rear corner and a slightly wider fillet radius further upstream, similar to what the Haas had. I would expect this to be a pretty standard feature. Higher up, we have a dual element beam wing up here, as opposed to the single element we spoke about before. Now, I had suspicions that a single would be sufficient. Obviously, they've gone for a long chord first element, followed by a shorter chord second element. I think there's going to be a really interesting avenue to see what teams choose what for here. It's worth noting that the second element of the Aston layout can actually go and carry on through underneath the exhaust, as opposed to a single beam element layout. Well, that's all for this analysis. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more content like this. Stay tuned for the next ones coming up in the series as further F1 cars launch and I get those out. And hopefully, I'll see you next time.